Well, first of all, it's the most sadistic thing that they could ever do. They kill her husband in front of the whole world. She's calling for justice, and now they issue an arrest warrant for her. That's just sadism, pure and simple. But most importantly, whenever they do that, and I've been subject to arrest warrants for a long time, and usually whenever they start like turning up the heat is because I've hit their Achilles heel somewhere, and she has too. The fact is that she has stepped into her husband's shoes, and she is now leading the opposition. Putin is scared of any type of opposition, and she's got a very powerful case. She is an aggrieved widow who wants justice, and I think a lot of people would respond very emotionally to that call, and a lot of people in Russia, and that's very scary for Putin. And so, of course, they're going to do this. This is a sign that her presence in her campaign means something, and it's also, thankfully, she's in the West where she can be kept safe, and so no one's going to arrest Yulia Navalny. But it does show that her presence in her campaign is threatening to Putin.
You've made it your life's work to pursue corruption and to corrupt people linked to the Kremlin. Just to go back to that mention of the frozen Russian assets, $300 billion worth almost. If you're successful in that campaign, do you think that will stop Putin? What effect do you think that will have on him?
I think it would be a game changer. War is all about resources. Russia has resources from the sale of oil. Ukraine doesn't. So every time Ukraine needs resources, they've got to go hat in hand begging to the West. And we give Ukraine some resources, but not enough. And I've heard it stated explicitly by officials in the U.S. government that the United States wants to give Ukraine enough so they don't lose, but not so much so they win. And the only way to stop this is to give them everything they need to win. And if Ukraine had that money, they could buy the weapons that they need to win. And it's not a certainty that they would win from that, but I can tell you something, that the moment Putin started hearing about the idea of confiscating that money, he starts, throwing out the nuclear card. He's ready to threaten nuclear war over that. If he's so upset by that, it shows that that's something that would really change the dynamics of the situation. And so we should absolutely do it without any question. Vladimir Putin is an evil dictator who's invading foreign countries, killing Ukrainian babies in the hospital and Ukrainian soldiers, and of course, killing his own soldiers in the process. And there's going to be a moment in time when this war ends. And it may very well end with the fall of the Putin regime. And if it does end with the fall of the Putin regime, there needs to be a new regime in Russia that's not hostile towards the West, that believes in democracy and free speech and good relations. And Vladimir Kara-Murza is an opposition politician that represents all the things that we need in a Russian government, a peaceful Russian government, a Russian government that doesn't kill neighbors, that treats its own citizens with respect. And so as much good work as we're doing supporting the Ukrainians and fighting back on these evil dictator Putin and his regime, we also need to be supporting a very small number of people in Russia who want to lead Russia towards a peaceful path. And Vladimir is now, after the murder of Alexei Navalny, that leader. He's really the hope for the West in having some type of decent relationship with Russia in the future after the Putin regime is over.
A prisoner swap was ruled out earlier this year by a former foreign minister. David Lammy has replied within days of becoming foreign secretary. Have you got any indication that he might actually reconsider that earlier decision?
Well, he's been in the job 5 days so far, and so I don't think that I haven't had a chance to push on that, which I will for sure. But it doesn't necessarily require Britain. If Britain has a policy of not doing it, Vladimir is an international hero, not just a British hero. And for example, he was recently granted honorary Canadian citizenship, which is something they've only done 7 times before in their history. Nelson Mandela, Malala, a few others, and so the Canadians are interested. Vladimir's wife is an American citizen. His 3 children are American citizens. He is a permanent green card holder in the United States when he's not in Russia. The Americans are interested. Vladimir's mother is a German citizen. She lives in Berlin. The Germans are interested. And that's not to mention the Lithuanians and Norwegians and so on. And so I believe that when a prisoner swap finally gets organized for a bunch of prisoners in Russia, that Vladimir should and will be included in that. And that's one of my main objectives, is to make sure that everybody understands that that we need to save this man's life. We saw what happened to Alexei Navalny. The same thing will happen to Vladimir if we don't save his life.
The brutality of Putin's Russia, which you know well, has been demonstrated very recently by this horrifying bombing spree on Ukraine this week. It included a children's hospital and a maternity centre in Kyiv. What response would you like to see from NATO allies to this? Would you like to see a direct response?
Well, so there's one thing which bothers me to no end, which is that the American government gives a lot of long-range missiles to Ukraine and tells Ukraine, though, you can't use them on Russian territory. So it's great that we're giving missiles to Ukraine, but to tell them that they have to fight with one hand tied behind their back is insanity. Russia is launching these bombs, the bomb that killed all these children in the cancer hospital, from Russia. How can you forbid them from hitting those targets? And so it seems just the most obvious thing in the world that Russia deserves whatever it gets, and Ukraine should be able to fight in the most effective way possible. And there shouldn't be conditions placed on the Ukrainians in using the weaponry that they have to hit Russian targets. And these are military targets we're talking about. I'm not talking about civilian targets in Russia. I'm not saying an eye for an eye. No, but no Russian children should be murdered in the same way as Ukrainian children. I'm saying that Russian soldiers and Russian armament batteries and Russian arms factories, those things should be open for targeting by the Ukrainians, and the Americans and other countries that are putting restrictions on should lift those restrictions right away.
But there is some relaxation on that, isn't there? Because when the Russian offensive on Kharkiv was launched, the US did actually start permitting limited use of those weapons, and it does, and to just defend that particular area from attack, and that has been relaxed a bit more. And the UK government is now saying Storm Shadow missiles, literally just now, would be able to be used against targets inside Russia itself. So it does look like it's moving in the direction that Ukraine wants so badly.
I think it is, and this is sort of a classic development of this war. Everybody's sort of too little, too late. Those children would still be alive today if we hadn't put those restrictions on. And if you can remember, at the very beginning of the war, we said no tanks for Ukraine. No, that would be provocative. That might provoke Putin to do something more. And of course, Putin is provoked by weakness, not by strength. He's a mafia thug, and so when he sees us putting these restrictions on, he does more terrible things. The time that he doesn't do terrible things is when he sees that there's going to be a real material consequence to him of doing terrible things.
On the front line, it's estimated that Russia's suffering casualties of more than 1,000 soldiers a day, but is not making significant progress on the battlefield. How long do you think Russia and the Kremlin will allow Putin to continue to prosecute a war that's no closer to achieving its aims?
Well, the problem we have is that Russia is not a democracy. Public opinion doesn't matter. The losses that Russia suffers doesn't affect Putin in any kind of psychological way at all. And just put those numbers in perspective for a second. During the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which lasted 10 years, Russia, or the Soviet Union, lost 15,000 soldiers. The numbers, as you mentioned, are 1,000 a day right now. So in 15 days, they've suffered the same casualties as the entire invasion of Afghanistan. And the numbers, according to Ukrainian sources, are well north of 500,000 casualties, 500,000 dead Russian soldiers. But to answer your question about how long could it last, the answer is a long time, because Putin doesn't care. And remember, during the Second World War, Stalin sent 25 million Russians to their death. And so Putin has a great capacity for pain. And what Putin is hoping for, and he's probably not wrong in his own assessment of probabilities, he's hoping that Donald Trump will become the next president of the United States, that America will cut off funding for Ukraine, that from lack of resources, Ukraine's defenses will crumble, and that he'll finally succeed, even with all the casualties he's had to suffer. And if he does that, then from his perspective, it's been a great venture going into Ukraine. And from our perspective, it will be an absolute disaster, not just for Ukraine, but then Putin will be lining up and targeting the Lithuania or Estonia or Latvia or even Poland. And those countries are members of NATO. And then we have this terrible situation of, let's say Donald Trump is president, will he honor the Article 5 of NATO? And I think based on his statements about NATO so far, he might very well not. If there's no more Article 5, then the question is, will Europe honor Article 5 without the Americans' help? And if not, then one of two things happen. Either we're directly at war with Russia without the Americans, or we're not, and Vladimir Putin runs roughshod all over former Soviet countries.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.